Good day, folks, and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with your host, the Anorak. Last year, I looked at 5 Miles Out, an album from 1982 by the beloved multi-instrumentalist Mike Oldfield. Probably a random choice to start off with on my part, but still. So I figured I'd do not one, but two albums in a row. So let's start things off with possibly his most well-known composition. But first, a little bit of background and history. Mike was quite the musically gifted and talented individual even from a young age, learning to play guitar at 10 years old. In 1968, when he was merely at least about 15 years of age, he and his elder sister, Sally Oldfield, formed a duo called the Sally Angie or the Sally Angie. It's kind of hard to pronounce. And they only made one album in 1969 called Children of the Sun. After which, in 1970 and 71, he was involved in a few albums by Soft Machine member Kevin Ayers, and over time had experimented with many different instruments and gained experience from it as a result. Kind of like me, come to think of it. So from there on, he started work on various bits and pieces, ideas, melodies, and experiments, and all these would come together to form and become part of a much greater track. He would do nearly all of the instruments himself, a trademark of which he would keep doing mostly throughout his discography. And he was only 19 when he wrote and recorded all this. Oh yes, you heard it all right. 19 years old. Really think about that. And after a few months, the album was finally released in May 1973, around 50 years ago, and the rest would be history, selling over 2.7 million copies in the UK alone and over 15 million worldwide, and reaching number one in the UK albums chart for a whole week. And this is pretty much the first official record released by Virgin Records, which had been founded the previous year. And we're going to talk about that album today. So let's jump into Mike Oldfield's opus, his 1973 debut album, Tubular Bells. The cover is simple and iconic. That image of the bent tubular bell is a distinct example of iconography that would be associated with Mike Oldfield's body of work, most especially his Tubular Bell series. It was actually and apparently inspired by how he played such bells so much that he ended up damaging at least one of them. The overall artwork was done by Trevor Key, who would go on to do the artwork for New Order's Technique album in 1989. He had this little bell here superimposed over this nice little simple shot of the sky and crashing waves below on the beaches of Sussex. Mike himself recommended that the album title and his name would be in such small lettering, as so it wouldn't distract too much or dominate the imagery, which I think is a good choice on his part, because the overall artwork alone is eye-catching as is. So Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Group and Virgin Records, wanted the album to be called Breakfast in Bed, yes, seriously, and have the cover be the image of a boiled egg cracked open to reveal human blood. Of course, as you can imagine, Mike could put the kibosh on that idea, and went with what we have now. Good choice and decision then. I don't think many people would have taken it seriously if they had to refer to it as Breakfast in Bed. However, that egg idea would be reused and modified for his 1991 album Heaven's Open, the last one he made, ironically or not, for the Virgin label. So, let's actually talk about the music itself, shall we? One thing we should note is that this album is essentially two long tracks, both of which are halves of a much bigger musical piece. So I'll still go over some of the noticeable moments in both these parts and talk a bit about what I liked about them and how such sounds were achieved. So let's start off with side 1 and Tubular Bells part 1. And yeah, I have no doubt that even if you hadn't heard of Mike Oldfield before, you'd probably have heard this very familiar opening piano riff. This opening alone was used as the de facto theme music for the classic horror film, also from 1973, The Exorcist. Later that same year, in December to be exact. Honestly, listening back at this intro bit, I can understand why so. I'm not exactly considering this scary music per se. It does have this unworldly and almost suspenseful feel to it, like a little lonely mouse tiptoeing its way through a dark kitchen very late at night. And it just builds and builds with layer upon layers, with a bit of keyboards, a bit of bass, and a bit of woodwinds. Then, over 3 minutes in, we get a pretty cool and distinct guitar solo, possibly the first of which we'll hear not only in this album, but possibly the first of which we'll hear that trademark style across his music. Then at the 4 minute mark, that familiar yet developing Exorcist theme riff kinda goes out entirely as we get a new melodic section, and the key signature changes rather significantly. It does help in making the track more somewhat engaging and less potentially monotonous, despite essentially being a piece of continuous music. At the 7 minute mark, we get some pretty deep, chilling, and dramatic sounds like presumably a low buzzing of guitars and synthesizers, like an infernal march of the dead. And that only lasts for like 45 seconds. The mood pretty much changes radically and yet so naturally with every instrument that comes and goes to take the center stage. Sometimes it sounds calm and serene with some bells and acoustic guitars. Then next it would sound hyper and jumpy with some chunky electric guitars. Halfway through this, there's a little honky tonk sounding piano bit, which was apparently inspired by Mike's own grandmother, who played a similar instrument in pubs before the Second World War. Nice little tribute, I gotta say. And soon enough, we get into the climax of part 1, in which the late Vivian Stanshall of the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band, yes, seriously, there was a band with that kind of name, I love music, acts as a sort of master of ceremonies as he roll calls most of the instruments here. And as a little call and response, Mike plays off each of those instruments with the same looping melody: grand piano, reed and pipe organ, glockenspiel, bass guitar, double speed guitar, two slightly distorted guitars, mandolin, Spanish guitar, acoustic guitar, and of course, tubular bells. In fact, it was the way Vivian said that last bit that inspired Mike to use it as the title for this song and album. And listening to this whole thing is like visiting a concert in heaven, a great gig in the sky, if you will. The way those bells play and stand out with such striking gusto, and the choirs that follow make me feel like I'm in the greatest church on earth. If I ever have a wedding, or at least organize the music for someone else's wedding, I would have Brian May's rendition of the bridal chorus from the Flash Gordon soundtrack for the wedding march, and then have the tubular bells play as the bride and groom leave the church. Yeah, that's how I do it. And then it all ends with a single and lone acoustic guitar to close all things. This entire first part lasts for about 26 minutes, and let me tell you, it's 26 minutes of musical wonder. It's almost like a rock ballet. It's also hard to imagine this entire piece beyond the first 4 minutes, fitting the overall mood of the Exorcist film, because especially with how hopeful and triumphant sounding the ending is. Then we get to side 2 with Tubular Bells Part 2. And it's a natural continuation of the first part, starting off with an acoustic sounding guitar and bass. And like with the first part, this too slowly builds up with musical layers, such as a faint bit of choir, organ, and some extra exotic guitars like a mandolin or a lute. Once again, this opening section within the first 4 to 5 minutes loops a particular melody while adding on to it. Then soon, the melodies change as a flute, or maybe at least a flute sounding synth, takes center stage here. Then, nearly 9 minutes in, we get a guitar that's altered and filtered in a way that it emulates the sound of a bagpipe, another trademark sound of which we would also tend to hear for a lot of Mike Oldfield's musical body of work. Then halfway through into the overall track, we get into what could be referred to as the caveman section, or the Piltdown Man, as the credits on the album put it, wherein which over a nice little musical section with some piano, guitar, and even a drum kit, probably the only part in this to have any drums, we hear some rather gruff vocal chanting and gibberish for nearly 5 minutes tops. Supposedly, Mike had already done all the instruments at that point, but thought it would need something extra to it. Meanwhile, Richard Branson wanted him to have some actual vocals on it to make into a potential single. Annoyed by such a demand, Mike decided to just chug half a bottle of whiskey, head over to the recording studio where things were already set up, and just yelled and ranted gibberish nonsense at the microphone for like 10 minutes or so. As a result, he was unable to speak properly for about 2 weeks. One of the 2 engineers on the album, Simon Hayworth, then mixed a good chunk of those vocals onto a tape on a higher speed so that said voice would sound deeper and slower during normal speed. And that's what we got. One thing you have to admire Mike Oldfield for is, besides for his musical talent, is his sharp sense of humor. The reason he laid down those pilt-down caveman sounds to begin with was to get back at Richard, as if to say, okay, you want vocals? I'll give you vocals. You didn't ask for what kind of vocals specifically, so I'm just going to sound like the Tasmanian Devil's drunken uncle. And after all that, the mood changes back to calm and peaceful, with some organ and plucky guitars for a while. It's a good way to ease the ears and mind and tension after such strangeness with the deep vocal grunting. And it all ends out with a rendition of the Sailor's Hornpipe, a traditional piece of melodic music and dance that's often associated with the Royal Navy, and to some may sound like the theme song for Blue Peter. Boy, have I forgot to mention that in my previous video. Well, here's my honorable mention of that. In fact, Mike even made a rendition of the classic theme that would be used from 1979 and 1989 for a whole decade. It's a bizarre way to close out such an album like this, but honestly, only someone like Mike Oldfield could pull it off, especially when it gradually speeds up over the course, increasing the pace and possibly making any attempt to dance to it seem a bit hectic. But if you manage to get into it, it's a little odd yet fun way to go out on. And so, that was Peter Gabriel's Tubular Bells, and it is classic, which pretty much goes without saying at this point. For an album that's essentially 2 20-plus minute long tracks, it manages to keep keen ears going and doesn't get too monotonous or repetitive or anything like that. It actually changes the mood and tone every now and then, which is a big strength for this album, if not most of Oldfield's body of work. The range of instruments being utilized here, especially when nearly all of them was done by one person, again, mind you, was only 19 years old, is beyond range and diverse. The highlight, of course, being that the climax of part 1 with the whole Masters of Ceremonies and stuff, and of course, the ending of part 2 with the Sailor Hornpipe rendition. And yet, And yet again, this album, done by a 19-year-old dude. Even I could never pull that off. So, yeah, if you want to get into Mike Oldfield or introduce a friend or family to his music, or you're just a big fan of classic 70s prog rock in general, I can definitely recommend checking out Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. And maybe some of his other stuff to come. Speaking of which, next time, we look at another album by Mike Oldfield. And let me tell you, it's going to be a crisis that you won't get away from. Being carried away by a moonlight shadow.